Grabs Royal Guard horse to free it. Horse Guards, Royal Guard, King's Guard, Horse, London, 2024. Tourists filled the pavements, cameras hanging from their necks, maps folded in their hands. Red buses moved slowly through traffic, and the sound of footsteps, voices, and distant car horns blended into a constant hum. Near Horse Guard's parade, one of the city's most famous ceremonial locations, people gathered in small groups, waiting patiently to see something uniquely British. At the edge of the parade ground stood a royal guard on horseback. He sat tall and still, dressed in full ceremonial uniform, his posture straight and controlled. Beneath him was a large, powerful horse, well-groomed and fitted with polished equipment that shone softly in the daylight. The horse barely moved, except for an occasional shift of weight or a slow turn of its head. This calm presence was the result of years of careful training, though to an untrained eye it could look unusual or even uncomfortable. The guard remained silent and focused, following strict rules that required him to stay alert and composed at all times. Around him, tourists whispered to one another, pointing at the uniform, the horse, and the setting. Many lifted their phones to take photos or record short videos. Some smiled, some laughed softly, and others simply stared in fascination. This scene played out every day, yet it never seemed to lose its power to draw attention. Among the crowd was one individual who stood slightly apart from the others. While most people snapped a quick photo and moved on, this person stayed, watching the horse closely. At first, it was simple curiosity. The horse was tall and strong, its dark eyes calm but alert. The heavy ceremonial gear, the stillness, and the silence slowly began to raise questions in the observer's mind. As minutes passed, the observer noticed small details. The horse shifted its legs slightly. Its ears moved back and forth. It blinked slowly and breathed deeply. To most people, these were normal signs of a trained working animal standing at rest. But to this person, they looked like signs of stress. The longer they watched, the more convinced they became that something was wrong. The crowd continued to grow and shrink as people came and went. Children asked their parents questions. Tour guides spoke in low voices, explaining the history of the guards and their duties. The guard on horseback did not react to any of it. His stillness was part of the tradition, a symbol of discipline and focus. The horse, trained to remain calm in busy environments, stayed steady despite the noise and movement around it. The observers' thoughts began to race. They wondered how long the horse had been standing there. They imagined the weight of the equipment, the hard ground beneath its hooves, and the constant attention from strangers. In their mind, the horse was not a trained ceremonial animal, but a living creature being forced to endure discomfort for the sake of tradition. Nearby, a small sign clearly explained that the guards and their horses should not be touched or disturbed. There were also warnings about standing too close. Most people respected these rules, stepping back after taking their photos. The observer noticed the sign but dismissed it, believing that concern for the horse was more important than rules or traditions. The person's body language changed. What started as quiet observation slowly turned into visible tension. Their arms crossed tightly, then dropped to their sides. They leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed on the horse's face. Each small movement the horse made seemed to confirm their growing belief that it needed help. Meanwhile, the guard remained unaware of the internal struggle happening just a few feet away. His attention stayed forward, trained to watch for real threats and maintain order. The horse responded calmly to its rider, used to standing for long periods as part of its duty. For the animal, this was not punishment but routine. The observer felt a strong emotional pull. They remembered stories they had seen online about animals being misunderstood or mistreated. They thought about how often people walked past suffering without doing anything. In that moment, they decided they would not be one of those people. They believed they were witnessing a problem that others were ignoring. People around them continued to act normally. Some laughed, some posed for photos. A few glanced at the observer but did not think much of it. No one else seemed concerned. This only strengthened the person's belief that they alone had noticed the truth. The observer took a step closer, then another. They moved just beyond where most tourists stopped. A few people noticed and whispered, but no one intervened. The guard still did not react, following protocol that discouraged unnecessary engagement. The horse turned its head slightly, reacting to the movement nearby. To a trained professional, this was normal awareness. To the observer, it looked like a silent request for help. Their heart began to beat faster. Their thoughts narrowed, focused entirely on the idea of freeing the animal from what they believed was an unfair situation. In their mind, this was no longer a tourist attraction or a ceremonial duty. It was a moment of choice. Walk away and do nothing, or step in and help. The observer believed that history favored those who acted, not those who stood by. As the crowd shifted again, a small gap opened between people. The observer stood closer than ever to the horse, close enough to see the fine details of its harness and the slow rise and fall of its chest. The sounds of the city faded slightly, replaced by a sense of urgency. The guard remained perfectly still, eyes forward, unaware that the calm scene was about to change. The horse stood patiently, trained to trust its rider and its surroundings. The moment felt suspended, balanced between normal routine and unexpected action. What no one around them realized was that this quiet observation had already turned into a decision. The observer was no longer just watching. They were preparing to act, convinced that they were about to do the right thing, even if it meant breaking rules and challenging a centuries-old tradition. And in that moment, as London moved on around them, the line between concern and consequence was about to be crossed. The moment the decision settled in the observer's mind, everything began to feel different. What had once been a normal public space now felt tense and focused, as if the world had narrowed to just one horse, one guard, and one belief. The observer stood very still, trying to calm their thoughts, but inside, emotions were growing stronger by the second. They told themselves they were doing this for the right reason. They believed that caring meant acting, not watching from a distance. The rules posted nearby felt unimportant compared to what they thought the horse was feeling. In their mind, rules were created by people who did not truly understand animals. They believed kindness sometimes meant stepping outside what was allowed. The observer looked around again. The guard was still facing forward, calm and unmoving. The horse remained quiet, its breathing slow and steady. To others, this was a picture of control and training. To the observer, it looked like silence forced by habit. They thought the horse had no voice and that someone needed to speak for it. A group of tourists walked past, laughing softly as they reviewed photos on their phones. None of them stopped. None of them questioned what they were seeing. This made the observer feel even more alone in their concern. They wondered how so many people could stand so close and not feel the same worry. The observer took another small step forward. Their hands felt warm and slightly unsteady. They could now see the fine details of the horse's face, the texture of its skin, the gentle movement of its nostrils. The horse blinked slowly, calm, and aware. To the observer, this felt like trust. They believed the horse would understand their intention. In their thoughts, the observer imagined the horse finally being led away, allowed to rest freely, away from noise and crowds. They imagined themselves as someone who noticed what others ignored. This belief gave them a sense of purpose, even confidence. Doubt still existed, but it was being pushed aside by emotion. Nearby, a few people noticed how close the observer was standing. Some exchanged glances. One person quietly stepped back, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. Still, no one spoke up. The moment stretched on, quiet but charged. The guard continued his duty, trained to remain still unless there was a clear reason to respond. His focus stayed forward, his posture unchanged. The horse shifted its weight slightly, a natural movement after standing still. This small action felt significant to the observer, like confirmation of everything they believed. The observer's heart beat faster. They reminded themselves that they were not trying to cause trouble. They believed they were helping. In their mind, they were correcting a wrong, not creating one. The difference between intention and outcome had not yet become clear to them. The sounds of the city seemed distant now. The observer barely noticed the passing buses or conversations around them. Their attention was locked on the horse's reins, hanging neatly in place. Those reins became a symbol in their mind. They believed that if they could just hold them, they could guide the horse away from discomfort. Their hand lifted slightly, then dropped again. Hesitation returned for a brief moment. They wondered if they might be mistaken. But that thought was quickly replaced by another. What if they were right and no one else cared enough to act? The observer thought about how moments like this were often judged afterward, not during. They believed people would understand once they explained their reason. They believed that good intentions would speak louder than broken rules. Another step forward brought them within arm's reach. The horse's size was more noticeable now, powerful yet calm. The observer felt a strange mix of fear and determination. They told themselves that animals could sense kindness, that the horse would feel safe with them. Behind them, someone whispered, unsure of what they were seeing. A phone camera lifted quietly, recording without comment. The observer did not notice. Their focus was complete. The guard still had not moved. His training required him to remain composed, to avoid sudden reactions that could create confusion. He trusted his horse, just as the horse trusted him. This silent partnership had been built over years, though the observer did not know this. The observer reached out slowly, their fingers stretching toward the reins. Time seemed to slow. This was the point of no return, though they did not fully realize it yet. To them, it felt like the final step in doing what was right. When their hand finally made contact with the reins, the world changed instantly. The horse sensed the unfamiliar touch and lifted its head slightly, alert but controlled. It was not panic but awareness. The observer felt a surge of emotion, interpreting the movement as a response to their help. At the same moment, the guard became aware of the contact. His focus shifted immediately. His calm expression remained, but his attention sharpened. He gave a clear verbal instruction, firm and controlled, meant to stop the situation before it went further. The observer froze, surprised by the sudden sound. They had not expected the guard to speak. In their mind, the guard had been distant, almost unreachable. Hearing his voice made the situation feel real in a way it had not before. The horse adjusted its stance again, responding to both the rider and the unexpected touch. It remained trained and steady, but the change was noticeable. People nearby stepped back, sensing the shift in energy. The observers' confidence wavered. They still believed in their reason, but now they were aware of the attention they had drawn. Their action was no longer private or quiet. It was visible and it carried weight. The guard repeated his instruction, his tone serious but controlled. Nearby security personnel began to move closer, alert but calm. Their presence added another layer of reality to the moment. The observer released the reins instinctively, unsure of what to do next. The idea of simply walking away crossed their mind, but it felt impossible now. Too much had happened. Eyes were on them. The situation had grown larger than their original intention. Around them, the crowd buzzed with quiet reactions. Some looked concerned. Others looked confused. A few continued recording, sensing that this moment would soon be shared far beyond this place. The observer felt a mix of emotions, embarrassment, fear, and lingering belief that they had meant well. They realized, perhaps for the first time, that intention alone might not protect them from consequences. The horse settled back into position, guided by the rider's steady presence. The guard remained calm, maintaining control of both the animal and the moment. His training showed clearly now, not as coldness but as discipline. As security approached, the observer stepped back fully, hands raised slightly in a gesture of compliance. Their moment of action was over, replaced by uncertainty about what would happen next. The scene that had once felt quiet and routine now carried a sense of aftermath. The observer's belief had pushed them to act, but reality had responded quickly and firmly. What they thought would be a simple act of kindness had become something much more serious. And as the crowd continued to watch, the observer began to understand that the story was no longer just about a horse. It was about misunderstanding, emotion, and the powerful consequences of acting without full knowledge. The situation did not end the moment the observer stepped back. In many ways, that was only the beginning of a new phase. The space around the horse felt different now. What had once been calm and predictable was filled with quiet tension. People nearby stopped moving as freely as before, unsure whether to stay or leave. Conversations dropped to whispers. The observer stood a short distance away, heart still racing. Their hands felt empty after letting go of the reins, yet heavy with emotion. They replayed the moment in their mind again and again, wondering how something that felt so clear inside their thoughts had turned into something so serious so quickly. The guard remained steady on the horse, his posture unchanged. His voice had been firm but controlled, not angry. That detail stood out to the observer. They had expected shouting or chaos, but instead there was discipline and calm. This confused them. It did not match the picture they had created in their mind of a harsh system that needed to be challenged. The horse stood quietly once more. Its breathing was slow and even. It did not appear distressed or frightened. It leaned slightly into its training, responding to the familiar presence of the rider. To many watching, this confirmed that the animal was doing exactly what it had been trained to do. To the observer, this calm now raised new questions. Security personnel approached with careful steps. Their movements were deliberate, not rushed. They positioned themselves between the observer and the horse, creating clear space. Their expressions were serious but not aggressive. They spoke calmly, asking the observer to move further back and explain what had happened. The observer complied without resistance. The rush of emotion that had pushed them forward earlier had faded, replaced by a growing sense of uncertainty. Speaking now felt harder than acting had been. Finding the right words was difficult. They explained that they believed the horse needed help. They spoke about concern, about feeling that something was wrong. Their voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sudden realization that others did not share their interpretation of the situation. The security personnel listened carefully. They did not interrupt. When the observer finished speaking, one of them explained calmly that the horses were closely monitored, well cared for, and trained specifically for these environments. They explained that what looked unusual to some people was normal for ceremonial duty. As these words settled in, the observer felt a shift inside. Doubt, which they had pushed away earlier, now returned more strongly. They looked back at the horse, seeing it not just through emotion, but through this new explanation. The animal stood tall, alert, and calm, not trapped or struggling as they had imagined. Around them, people began to relax slightly. Some resumed walking. Others stayed, curious about how the situation would end. A few phones were still raised, quietly recording. The observer became aware of how public the moment had become. The guard remained mounted, his focus steady. He did not look at the observer directly, but his presence was constant. The observer realized that this guard trusted his horse completely, just as the horse trusted him. This mutual trust was something built over time, not something easily seen in a brief moment. The observer felt a wave of embarrassment. They wondered how many assumptions they had made without understanding the full picture. They had acted on feeling alone, without seeking information or asking questions. The weight of that realization settled heavily on them. Security personnel asked the observer to step further away from the area. They complied, walking slowly, their movements now careful and subdued. With each step, the excitement and urgency that had driven them earlier faded further, replaced by reflection. As they moved aside, the observer overheard snippets of conversation from the crowd. Some people spoke kindly, suggesting the observer had meant well. Others expressed frustration, saying rules existed for a reason. The mixed reactions mirrored the observer's own conflicted thoughts. The horse shifted slightly again, then became still. The routine returned. The guard adjusted his grip subtly, guiding the horse with practiced ease. Within moments, the scene began to look almost the same as it had before, as if the interruption had been carefully folded back into order. But for the observer, nothing felt the same. They stood off to the side, watching now with different eyes. They noticed how comfortable the horse appeared within its role. They saw the small signs of communication between rider and animal that they had missed before. They realized that their earlier focus had been narrow. Emotion had filled the space where understanding should have been. They had believed they were acting bravely, but now they questioned whether true care required more patience and learning. A security officer explained that approaching or touching working animals could create risk, even when intentions were good. The observer nodded, listening closely. They had not considered how their action might have affected not just the horse, but the rider, the crowd, and themselves. The observer felt a quiet regret, not just for what they had done, but for how quickly they had judged. They thought about how easily strong feelings could turn into actions without pause. They wondered how often this happened in other situations, far from public spaces. Slowly, the crowd thinned. Tourists moved on, some shaking their heads, others discussing the moment as they walked away. To many, it would become a short story to tell later. To the observer, it felt much larger. The observer remained for a moment longer, standing quietly at a distance. They watched as the horse flicked its ears, aware of its surroundings, calm and balanced. They noticed the strength in its stance, the confidence in its stillness. They realized that stillness did not always mean suffering. Sometimes it meant discipline, sometimes it meant trust. This understanding felt simple now, but it had been invisible to them earlier. Eventually, the observer turned away. Each step felt slower than before, heavier with thought. They did not feel angry or defensive anymore. Instead, they felt thoughtful, humbled by how easily perception could be mistaken for truth. Behind them, the ceremonial duty continued as it always had. The guard remained in place, the horse steady beneath him. The city flowed around them, unchanged by the brief disruption. But inside the observer, something had changed. The moment had become a lesson, one that would not fade quickly. They understood now that caring deeply also required listening, learning, and respecting systems they did not fully know. As they blended back into the moving crowd, the observer carried that realization with them. What began as a strong emotional response had ended in quiet reflection. And though the moment had passed, its meaning stayed, reminding them that good intentions alone were never enough without understanding. Time moved forward, but the moment stayed alive in many ways. Even after the observer walked away from the area, the impact of what had happened continued to spread quietly. The space near Horse Guard's parade returned to its usual rhythm, yet something unseen had shifted beneath the surface. Security personnel completed their checks and spoke briefly with the guard. Everything was calm and controlled. The horse remained steady, responding gently to familiar cues. There was no sign of harm or distress. The routine continued, just as it had countless times before. To many onlookers, the incident already felt like it belonged to the past. But for the observer, the experience followed them closely. As they walked through the streets of London, the noise of the city felt louder than before. Every sound seemed sharper, every movement more noticeable. Their mind replayed the event again and again, each time revealing something new they had not considered before. They thought about how quickly emotion had taken control. What had started as concern had grown into certainty without proof. They realized how powerful feelings could be, especially in unfamiliar situations. The idea was uncomfortable, but they could not ignore it. Later that day, the observer found a quiet place to sit. They watched people pass by, each person carrying their own thoughts, worries, and beliefs. It made them wonder how many misunderstandings happened every day simply because people saw the world through different lenses. The observer checked their phone and noticed messages and alerts. Someone had shared a short video of the moment online. The comments were mixed. Some praised the observer's concern, others strongly criticized the action. Reading these reactions brought another wave of emotion. At first, the observer felt defensive. They wanted to explain themselves, to tell everyone what they had felt in that moment. But as they continued reading, something shifted. Among the opinions were calm explanations about the training of ceremonial horses, the role they played, and the care they received. The observer paused and began to read more carefully. They followed links, watched interviews, and learned details they had not known before. They learned about daily routines, veterinary care, and how the horses were selected and trained for public environments. This new information was not presented with anger or judgment. It was factual and clear. And slowly, it began to reshape how the observer understood what they had seen. They realized that their mistake had not been caring. It had been assuming. They had filled gaps in their knowledge with emotion instead of curiosity. This realization was uncomfortable but important. As the evening approached, the observer thought about consequences beyond themselves. They considered the guard, who had been doing his duty calmly and professionally. They thought about how sudden actions could create risk, even when no harm was intended. They also thought about the horse. The animal had reacted calmly, guided by training and trust. The observer realized that their action meant to help could have confused the horse instead. This thought stayed with them deeply. The observer began to understand that responsibility came with action. Acting on feeling alone, without understanding the full situation, could lead to outcomes far different from what was intended. The next day, the story continued to circulate. Some people discussed it as an example of misplaced concern. Others used it to talk about how easily moments could be misunderstood in public spaces. The observer noticed how quickly stories changed as they passed from person to person. What surprised them most was how rarely people paused to reflect. Many jumped to strong opinions without knowing the full context, just as the observer had done at the start. This parallel was impossible to ignore. The observer felt a quiet responsibility growing inside them. They could not undo what had happened, but they could learn from it. They could also choose how they moved forward. They decided not to respond publicly or argue online. Instead, they focused on understanding. They continued reading, learning, and listening. This process felt slower than reacting, but it felt more honest. Meanwhile, at Horse Guards Parade, life continued as usual. Guards rotated shifts. Horses were groomed, fed, and cared for. Tourists came and went, taking photos and asking questions. Most would never know about the brief moment of tension that had passed through the space. For those who worked there, the incident became a reminder. Training sessions included quiet discussions about public interaction, awareness, and maintaining calm in unexpected moments. Not because something had gone wrong, but because preparation was always ongoing. The guard involved returned to duty with professionalism unchanged. He understood that public spaces brought unpredictable situations. His training had prepared him not just to respond, but to remain calm when others were not. The horse continued its routine, guided by familiar hands and voices. Animals lived in the present, not in replayed moments. The brief disruption had passed without leaving a mark. For the observer, however, the experience became a turning point. They noticed themselves slowing down more often, questioning first impressions instead of acting immediately. They became more aware of how easily emotions could take over when understanding was limited. They also reflected on how good intentions were often shared by many people, yet outcomes differed based on knowledge and patience. Caring was not just about feeling strongly. It was about learning deeply. The observer thought about how many times they had seen something online and reacted instantly, without context. Now, they felt more cautious. They understood that moments captured on camera rarely showed the full story. Days passed and the event slowly faded from public attention. New stories replaced it, as they always did. But inside the observer, the lesson remained active. They realized that respect was not passive, it required effort. It meant trusting that systems and traditions often existed for reasons not immediately visible. It also meant knowing when to ask questions instead of taking action. The observer did not feel ashamed anymore. Instead, they felt changed. The experience had challenged them in a way that growth often does, quietly but deeply. They imagined returning to the same place someday, standing again near Horse Guards Parade. They wondered how different it would feel now, armed with understanding instead of assumption. The idea brought a sense of calm. They knew they would see the horse differently, not as something trapped, but as part of a partnership built on trust and training. The observer understood now that moments of misunderstanding could become moments of learning if approached with honesty. The consequence of their action was not punishment or blame, but reflection. And in that reflection, they found something valuable. A reminder that the world was complex, that quick judgments rarely told the whole story, and that true care often began with listening rather than acting. As life moved on, the observer carried this lesson forward. It shaped how they reacted, how they listened, and how they chose to engage with the world around them. What began as a moment of misplaced urgency became a lasting reminder. Understanding must walk beside compassion, or compassion could lose its way. In the weeks that followed, the observer noticed small changes in themselves. These changes were not dramatic or obvious to others, but they were real. The way they looked at situations, the way they paused before reacting, and the way they listened all began to shift. The experience near Horse Guards Parade had quietly settled into their thoughts, shaping how they moved through daily life. The observer found themselves thinking often about that day, not with regret or frustration, but with curiosity. They replayed the moment not to criticize themselves, but to understand it better. Each time they noticed something new, a detail they had missed, a feeling they had misunderstood, a lesson they had only partially learned at first. They began to realize that moments like this were not about being right or wrong. They were about growth, about seeing where emotion had filled space that understanding should have been. This realization brought a sense of calm rather than discomfort. One afternoon, while walking through another busy public place, the observer saw a working animal performing its duty. This time, instead of reacting quickly, they stopped and observed quietly. They watched the calm movements, the communication between handler and animal, and the trust that guided every step. They felt something different. Instead of concern mixed with urgency, they felt respect. They understood that working animals were not simply present. They were trained, supported, and cared for in ways that were not always visible to those passing by. This moment confirmed how much they had changed. The observer smiled softly, grateful for the lesson they had learned, even though it had come through discomfort. They also became more thoughtful about stories shared online. When they saw short clips or emotional posts, they paused before forming opinions. They asked themselves what might be missing, who might be unseen, what context might be left out. This habit spread into other areas of their life. Conversations became slower and deeper. Listening became more important than responding. They realized how often people spoke from feeling rather than understanding, just as they once had. The observer shared their experience privately with close friends, not to seek approval, but to explain how their perspective had changed. Some friends listened carefully. Others were surprised by the honesty. These conversations opened space for reflection, not judgment. They noticed that when they spoke with humility instead of defense, people responded with openness. This felt meaningful. It showed them that growth could influence others without needing to be loud or dramatic. Over time, the observer returned to central London. One day, they found themselves near Horse Guards Parade again. This time, they stood at a respectful distance. The scene was familiar, yet it felt entirely different. The guard stood tall, calm, and focused. The horse beneath him was steady, alert, and confident. The observer noticed how comfortable the horse appeared in its role. They saw the small signs of communication, the quiet partnership built on trust. They felt no urge to step closer or interfere. Instead, they felt appreciation. They understood now that care often existed quietly without needing to announce itself. Tourists gathered as they always had. Cameras clicked. Voices murmured. The observer watched with new eyes, aware of how easily moments could be misunderstood. They noticed a family nearby explaining the scene to a curious child. The child asked why the horse stood so still. The parent answered gently, explaining training and discipline. The observer smiled, recognizing how understanding could be passed on simply and calmly. As they stood there, the observer felt gratitude, not just for the lesson, but for the chance to learn it without lasting harm. They understood that not all mistakes offered that opportunity. They reflected on how the moment had traveled far beyond that place. It had shaped their thinking, influenced their conversations, and softened their reactions. It had taught them patience. The observer also thought about responsibility. They understood now that actions in public spaces carried weight. They affected not just one person or one animal, but everyone nearby. This awareness made them more mindful. They left the area feeling light, not burdened. The experience no longer felt like something that defined them. Instead, it felt like something that guided them. As time continued to pass, the observer carried the lesson quietly. It appeared in small choices, asking before assuming, listening before reacting, learning before acting. They realized that true care was not always dramatic. Often it was quiet, patient, and informed. It involved trust, not control. The observer understood now that traditions and systems were not perfect, but they were often built with intention and care. Questioning them required knowledge, not just emotion. They also learned something deeper about themselves. They had the capacity to reflect, to change, and to grow. This gave them confidence, not in being right, but in being willing to learn. One evening, as they watched the city lights reflect on the pavement, the observer thought about how many moments passed unnoticed each day. How many chances there were to choose understanding over reaction. They felt hopeful, not because the world had changed, but because they had. The story that once seemed dramatic now felt simple in its meaning. It was not about a single action, but about awareness. About how quickly emotion could lead and how gently understanding could guide. The observer did not see themselves as a hero or a mistake. They saw themselves as human, someone who cared, learned, and grew. And in that realization, they found peace. Life continued as it always did. Horses stood calmly. Guards performed their duties. Crowds gathered and moved on. But somewhere among them, the observer walked with a quieter mind and a more thoughtful heart, carrying a lesson that would stay with them long after the moment itself had faded. The experience had ended, but its meaning lived on. And that meaning was simple, steady, and true. Compassion becomes stronger when it is guided by understanding.